Next up, we have 3 flash talk presentations, so I'll invite those 3 speakers to come down and sit on the couch here. So they have the interesting challenge of doing a presentation in 10 minutes, which I'm sure is quite difficult. They'll each share their presentations one after the other, so I'm going to introduce all 3 at once so we can make the most of their limited time. First, we have Jessica Walsh, an assistant professor in the College of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Then we have Nicole Wall, great, project planner in water at Olsson, which is an engineering and design firm. And then we have Jennifer Schellpeper, integrated water management division manager at the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. If we do have any extra time at the end, we'll take a couple of questions, but no pressure. You already have a very short time frame, so I'll invite Jessica up to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. This is the largest group of people I've ever presented to, so this is really exciting. It's really an honor to be here speaking at this conference. I'm going to talk quickly about the intersection of research and science and journalism. My background is as a journalist. I worked mostly in the Boston area for about 12 years, just covering all kinds of stuff, mostly crime and politics. And I moved to Nebraska about 12 years ago, and eventually went back and got my master's degree. And part of my master's degree program was to do kind of like a final big project, like a thesis. And I started looking around and thinking, what is missing? What big story is not being told in Nebraska? And I was reading the Wall Street Journal one morning, and there was a story about a man in Wisconsin who had bought a big acreage, and he was getting his water from a well. And the story was about how he increasingly was having a hard time finding clean water. His well was contaminated with nitrates. And I started thinking, I haven't heard a lot about this in Nebraska. I wonder who's writing about this and what is being communicated to the public. So I started to do some research, and I discovered the UNL Water Center. I know I saw Crystal Powers here and Jesse Strita when he was at the Water Center. And I met with them and I said, who's writing about this and what do we know about nitrate contamination in the water in Nebraska? And they said, basically, you need to write about this. This is a story that people need to hear. And so I did end up doing a multimedia website called Nitrates in Nebraska, and I also published a story in the World Herald looking at how, sort of what is going on with nitrate contamination in Nebraska. Eventually, I got hired at UNL, and now I do research on journalism. So I'd like to share that background to sort of share what I know about covering environmental issues and sort of some reflexivity in terms of how I got to the point where I'm now studying how journalists cover the water and cover environment. So real briefly, I want to talk about why we care about local news, why I care about local news. If you think about it, if you did grow up in a small community, you might have tacked up a high school sports picture on your fridge, right? Or it was the place where you learned about what was going on in your community. That still exists, and people still trust local news more than they trust national news. So that's one reason why I think it's important to study local news and how people in small communities get news. And when newspapers close, bad things happen. There's less civic engagement, more voter polarization. And sadly, there is a local news crisis in America. Small newspapers are closing and merging, and there's fewer people covering the environment, covering also schools and everything else. So, and also community newspapers they're connectors, they're historical archives. So for those reasons, I think it's really important to try to understand what's going on with news coverage at this level. So a few things I have been studying is looking at, number one, how journalists cover the news, and then also how they think about covering the news. I mostly focus on rural and local journalism, and there's not a lot of journalism scholars who are covering at this sort of micro level how rural journalists are covering these really important big issues. As a lot of you know, it's people in rural communities a lot of the times who are really in this situation where there are water problems. So that's one thing I do is I study how news organizations are covering, this story was about nitrate contamination. And I also study how journalists think about coverage and why they make the decisions they make. And I think this is important as you think about if you're ever in any role where you're communicating with someone in the media, hopefully this will sort of help you gain a little insight into some of the pressures that journalists are under, and also what they're covering and maybe how things could be done differently. So in this small content analysis I did, I found that there was a lot of meeting coverage. There's a lot of sort of a lack of in-depth coverage, which makes sense if you think about a newsroom that might have 3 people. And so anyway, I think it's really important to understand how this job is being done and kind of what the out product is, and then to think about how it could be done differently and what ways there might be to, if you better understand kind of how the news is made, how you could better communicate with the media. There's this common adage in the media, which maybe some of you have heard, is that the media don't tell you what to think, but they tell you what to think about. And I like to keep that in mind when I'm doing research, because I do really believe it's true. It was sort of, this general idea was popularized with agenda setting theory in the 70s. It really looked at how when a newspaper puts something on the front page or covers something, or the way they cover it, that really sets the public agenda, the public conversation. And one way that journalists do this is, there's all kinds of ways. You can see the list of ways, but one thing I'm really interested in is the language that's used. And so one study I'm working on right now with funding from the Doherty Institute looks at the extended parallel process model, and it looks at how, in what ways, if at all, journalists covering water quality, water pollution, and nitrates in the water, how much, if at all, this model is being incorporated into their stories. Obviously, most journalists don't know what this is. They're not trying to write to this model. But looking at coverage in terms of, is there a threat? If there's a threat presented, is there a solution? Is there any self-efficacy language for the reader to sort of be able to better process that threat information? And I know just from studying local news in the Midwest that there are stories about water contamination, and they do contain threat information. So just briefly, this study that I'm working on right now, we're looking at the presence of threat and efficacy language and solutions frames in Midwest news stories with some keywords that I know a lot of you are interested in: water quality, water pollution, and nitrates, and trying to figure out, what are the ways that journalists are doing their job and how are they communicating with the public. And so we're working on data analysis right now, but finding that while there is some threat information, there might be a lack of self-efficacy language in this coverage. And so I think that's really important to think about if we're going back to local news being an important deliverer of information. People get their news from everywhere these days: Facebook, their friends, other sources. But I do think local news can still be a really important source of information. And so thinking about how journalists are doing their job and how they're framing things, I think is beneficial for journalists, but also beneficial for the people who might be working with them as sources and stakeholders. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening to this flash talk.
Well, I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Nicole Walsh, and now I need to go back one slide. Okay. My name's Nicole Walsh. I'm a project planner and also a water resources team member at Olsson Engineering. My office is here in Lincoln, Nebraska, but we have offices all over the nation. We've expanded quite a bit over the last 10 years. But previous to my role at Olsson, I have to step back a bit. In 2008, I believe, 2009, maybe Mark Sabota can remind me, I answered an ad here at UNL looking for an anthropologist who would be able to work with the public and stakeholders on complex climate issues related to drought specifically. It was the first time since I had been out of graduate school that I had found my dream job. Everything that was in that job description, I felt like I could do, or I could learn to do. And so through my tenure at the National Drought Mitigation Center, I had a great mentoring team, had a lot of great experiences with my team, was able to work locally, nationally, internationally on research and operational products that were also focused in planning and policy making. So I worked there for about 12 years. I went internationally and worked in Ethiopia and then came back right before COVID, literally during the month that COVID hit the US. And I didn't know what to do. So I went back to rural Nebraska and I stayed with my parents for a couple years, helping them out, worked in the public health sector on vaccinations, and kind of got a sense of the public pulse during COVID of what was happening, not just with that disease vector and all the issues related to it, but also what was happening in Nebraska with water and the environment. I came back to Lincoln about a year ago. I worked with JEO for about a year, working on some drought planning needs that they had, and then transferred over with Jim Schneider. Maybe some of you attended his session yesterday. It was a great session on kind of new data, ET, open ET, and how it applies to real life complex problems. But now I'm working for him at Olsson and really loving it. So what do we all have in common? We all experience the impacts of droughts, floods, and extreme weather. Obviously, that's what a lot of our topics are about here today. And we all need food, and most importantly, we all need water, both quality and quantity. Just a quick rundown. We all know that drought has been hitting the US pretty hard, and we have the best drought experts, I believe, in the world here, so I won't go into all the evolution of the drought over the past few years. But we're still experiencing drought, even though we've had some floods recently in the United States, and we still don't know what the impacts of those floods may be, but I'm pretty sure drought is going to stick around. And so now we have to become more aware of the drought and flood interaction and that connection, and coming up with solutions that not only address drought, but also floods at the same time. I'm just showing you some photos that I remember. I wasn't here in 2019 for the big floods. I was in Africa at the time. But I went to my team at Olsson and said, do you remember that flood in Salt Creek in 2015? They're like, yeah, we have lots of photos. So I just thought I'd throw those out there if you all remember the impacts of that flood. And of course, over the past few years, for a variety of different issues, politically or whatnot, there's been a certain level of public distrust. Perhaps it's maybe through the media. I won't go there, but it's also led to a lack of public engagement. And I believe at Olsson and some of the other private firms and colleagues I'm working with, and also my colleagues that still work in the public sector, we're still really dedicated in trying to get the public involved at every level of what we're doing in terms of climate issues and the products and the research that we're trying to put out there. One of my great people that I always go to kind of get inspiration is the past Martin Luther King Jr., because not only was he dedicated to a civil rights movement, but he also, I don't think a lot of people know that he was very I guess, influential in community engagement and wanting people to get out into the public to not just have their voices heard, but to also volunteer their service. So I really feel as we move forward with a lot of the work that we do, we need to be not only giving our, not only disseminating information and trying to gather back public feedback, but also volunteering our time and efforts, perhaps in our own local neighborhoods and communities. So how do we do this? So just based on my experience and the people I've worked with, some of the solutions in trying to involve the public more is kind of redefining what public engagement means. And this has to take place early in the planning phases of your projects, and even in the proposal process, so you can keep refining it, redefining it. So it's really important to answer that first question: how does this project serve the public? What are the benefits? What might be some of the disadvantages? You have to identify all those things ahead of time in your project planning. Also, very important is identifying who your public is and not missing anybody. And then also distinguishing between public and stakeholders. There's one thing just to put a public notice out there and say you've done your job. It's another thing to really find the stakeholders that need to be at the table and to call them and to email them and to even show up where they might be hanging out and talking to them about this project and making sure that they're at your meetings and at the table. And then thirdly, how do I effectively communicate, or how do we effectively communicate and involve the public? How frequent? Where do we need to meet? The timing in the engagement is very crucial. We know with COVID, we had to take it virtually. Well, now we're finding that maybe virtual, people are just kind of burned out on the virtual thing, and we need to get back in the meeting rooms at some extent. So, and maybe we have to have a balance, a hybrid of doing both moving forward. And then most importantly too, I believe that as a team, as a public engagement team, you have to set up some kind of process to evaluate your engagement and your effectiveness. You just don't want to go out there and say, I've done my job, now I'm going to move on to the next project. It's really, really crucial, I feel, to have a good evaluator on your public engagement team that's going to really be there to help you kind of tell you what you did right, what you did wrong, what you could do better. And then I'm just going to push the budget up a little bit higher, is that don't skip on your budget for public engagement and stakeholder interactions. You really need to think about what it's going to cost ahead of time, and try not to cut those corners, because the public will see that and they'll say that they're not involved, or they weren't involved because they weren't thought of. And so, you know, and sometimes it takes a team approach, and so valuing your team and paying them well, and also just putting that time and effort into the public engagement process is going to pay off in the end fully. When I started at the National Drought Mitigation Center, the former director, Mike Hayes, said to me, you know, I want to invest in your training. So, you know, pick a program that you want to be skilled or get some training and get some skill set in terms of working with the public. And so I identified the International Association for Public Participation. And at the time, we didn't really have a strong chapter here in Nebraska, so I kind of traveled a few places and kind of got some other kind of viewpoints on IAP2 and how it works at different levels of the public engagement spectrum or process spectrum. Now we have a very robust IAP2 chapter here in Nebraska. We have a lot of members, a lot of people being trained, which is really great to see. But really the basis of the spectrum is just kind of setting those goals early, identifying at what level you need to engage your public. It goes from an informed to an empowerment level, and sometimes you don't need to reach the empowerment level, that's all right. Sometimes you might just come in based on your project scope at the involvement level. And the reason why that I like this older kind of diagram is because it also shows you the example techniques that you can use in terms of facilitation. And that's a whole other ball game, is how you actually engage with the public. It's one thing to know how to set up the public engagement plan. It's another thing to be a skilled facilitator. So really testing out these facilitation techniques with your team is very important. And at the Drought Center, this is kind of what we were dedicated in doing, is before we would go out and work with our stakeholders, we had a pretty set kind of stakeholder agenda where we kind of knew exactly how we were going to do things and how we were going to work with our groups ahead of time. And we worked as a team beforehand, before we even went out there and did this willy-nilly. So it's very important to understand those techniques and how you're going to implement them. Just a couple case studies to wrap up. I'm sure I'm getting to my 10 minutes here. In 2010 to 2012, I was part of a team with Anthony Schutz at the College of Law, and then also Alan Tompkins, at the time the former director at the Public Policy Center. And we were the facilitators for LB 1057, defining sustainability in the Nebraska Republican River Basin. And for 2 years, we brought stakeholders, surface water, groundwater, and also state officials to the table to start defining what sustainability is and what it may look like in the future for that basin. It was a very tedious process in terms of trying to come to a definition of consensus, but it was very valuable in the end because a framework was established. Even though a plan wasn't established, that wasn't really the mission, but a framework was. And it was the first time, I believe, that these stakeholders actually sat down at the table to discuss issues of water sustainability and what that means for them in the future. And keep in mind that some of these producers were both surface water and groundwater users, which makes it even more complex. And when you work under the compact, which I'm sure Jennifer will discuss here in a minute, it can be quite difficult. Most recently at JEO, I worked with the Lower Loop Natural Resources District on finishing up their drought plan. I encourage you to go to their website. It's a very robust drought plan in terms of the stakeholder engagement and also the management actions. I'm just really, really proud of this drought plan. I just saw the assistant general manager last week, had a meeting with him, and they are using their drought plan and they are working on their drought management actions at this very moment. So I'm very proud to see that happening, because it's one thing to have a drought plan, it's another thing to implement it and to kind of follow it and keep revising it. And it seems like this group kind of has it figured out. This is just real quickly kind of how that spectrum matched up with their drought plan. So they incorporated a drought scenario workshop. I wasn't part of the process during that phase, but they use a lot of drought scenarios in terms of engaging with their stakeholder network to help basically, in the end, that last bullet, find opportunities to reduce drought impacts through mitigation and conservation efforts. Also, we had several drought-focused discussions on their monitoring tools, their triggers and response actions, and then also, in the end, deciding on which management actions mattered the most. And so they used a lot of Mentimeter polling and focused discussions during that phase as well. And then finally, Lincoln 2.0 or Water 2.0. This is a project that is going to establish a second water source for the city of Lincoln. And Olsson will be involved in the Lincoln water rights phase of that. Don't ask me a lot of questions about it right now. I just got assigned to it last week, so I'm kind of learning all the gist of what I need to do, moving it ahead in the future. But I want to say that this is a very robust public engagement project. It's going to take several years to kind of work out all the kinks and to have everybody hopefully's agreement on this project, but it's necessary. And just to mention back to the Drought Center too, kind of in the early master plan phase of the Lincoln, water plan, the Lincoln water system and a lot of the people that are involved in this process were looking at climate tools. They were looking at drought forecasts. They were really trying to understand back in 2012 how drought was going to affect the city. And I believe that, I just have to give a shout out to Lincoln because I think that they're really trying to stay on top of climates and floods moving into the future. And I know I'm out of time. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I know you've been sitting quite a while, so if you need to fidget in your seats to stay awake and pay attention, I definitely encourage that. And you should have 10 minutes or less left before you get the opportunity to get up and go to the next session. So just stick out with me this last few minutes, I promise. So I'm Jennifer Schellpeper. I am with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. I've been working there for more than 20 years. And the whole time I've been working on integrated water management. That is really the main theme of what I do in the water planning division. Our office manages the surface water component itself. That is the aspect of the water that we regulate in Nebraska. But then we partner with our local natural resources districts to also manage the hydrologically connected groundwater. So that's our integrated water management. And what I'll be talking about today, I'll talk about the keys that are in our toolbox that make that successful in our legislation, as well as talk to you about some of the challenges that we've found along the way. So looking back at history first, I want to say that what we do in Nebraska is really built upon what we've learned in history. If you look back in the 1800s to John Wesley Powell, he offered the advice that in the arid American West, you build your political boundaries on watershed boundaries. So that's what you see on the slide here. And you'll hear me talk about that more. Further, then Eleanor Ostrom completed her work in the 90s, and she did studies of over 1,000 cases worldwide looking at common pool resources and how best to govern those common pool resources, such as groundwater and surface water. And when you look at her principles, you'll find that Nebraska Integrated Water Management follows those principles that she had listed in her research. So you can see Nebraska water planning on the left side and Eleanor Ostrom's principles on the right side. I don't have time in the flash talk to cover all of this today, but we'll hit a few key highlights of what we do have in our legislation. The first of those is well-defined boundaries for water management. This is clearly called out in our law to have maps that delineate these. We do follow our surface watershed boundaries. You can see those on the map here. And we also have our natural resource district boundaries, which are where we manage our groundwater, following those surface water boundaries as well. So that's one of the features about groundwater management that makes Nebraska unique, is that when this was put into place in 1972, we've been following our political management of groundwater along those same surface watershed boundaries. So we've had 50 successful years now of having our natural resources districts in place. Another item is having your resource boundaries well defined, knowing exactly who has the legal rights to use your groundwater and your surface water. On this map, you see delineated our surface water rights and our groundwater rights, those parcels that can be legally irrigated across the state. And we've just come out with this map published on our website for this most recent year, and our goal is to be able to update these digitized parcels and make them publicly available every year. We've got a couple of groundwater NRDs where we're still waiting on some data, but every year we'll keep adding and updating this information. Another principle is monitoring. And again, it's all built into our statutes and our laws, so it makes it easy to follow. We regularly monitor our plans. We look at our goals, our objectives, our action items, and make sure that we are making progress to our goals through time. And of course, a key to being able to do this is to have science and data. I've heard that talked about as one of the challenges, making sure we have that data, making sure we're transparent, we're overcoming obstacles to get that information out there and available. And that's what's the foundation of our integrated water management pyramid that you see on this slide. And not only the basic data, but then also the hydrologic models and analysis that are part of that. From there, then we build on our goals and objectives, our stakeholder involvement, actually drafting the plan itself. And when I say stakeholder involvement, we don't just consult. You saw that on the IAP2 graphic that was shown earlier, but we go to the collaborate end of that. Again, our statute calls for us to collaborate with those stakeholders, so we literally sit around the table and work word for word with those folks, the policymakers, to write our goals and objectives for that plan. Everyone has invested involvement, and that is collaboration, and what we heard in the plenary session yesterday and repeated a few times today, right? There's labor involved in that. It is not a short, easy process. It takes involvement, it takes time. It's also labor intensive because you have those hydrologic models, that analysis that you're trying to be transparent with, and you need to bring that to the stakeholders in a way that they can digest it, a way that they can understand it, and they can use it to make good informed decisions about what will be in the plan. So the challenge there is hiring those skilled modelers, keeping them on staff, hiring the skilled communicators who can bring that out and explain it to everybody, and then the person who's between those two, right, who can link the two, because your modelers can't always communicate well to your good communicators, so you've got to have somebody in between. So there's a challenge and a commitment to make sure all the right staff are there. And in law, in Nebraska, that process is defined to take up to 5 years. So you also have to have the wherewithal to last that 5-year period, to go from where you start the plan to where you adopt that plan. And then it doesn't end. You implement that plan, you monitor it, and you continue doing that over and over again so that you can adapt. That's our adaptive management process we have in Nebraska. So another key component of all this, and I think the most key component of it all, is building trust with those stakeholders. A piece of that is, of course, the data and being transparent, having that education component. But another piece is seeing them as human beings. I heard this yesterday, that humans are part of the constellation of what we are doing here. If you neglect that fact, you really are not going to have a successful plan in the end. And so you have to also hire people who are willing to do that, people who have the passion to go out there day after day, year after year, month after month, because the problems don't go away. You still have to engage with those people over and over again. So you've got to have those people on staff who are willing to do that and have the passion for the work. So to round up today, I have 2 quick success stories that I want to share with you. Like I said, I've been in integrated management since the beginning in Nebraska, so for 20 years. I've had the privilege and opportunity of interacting with many stakeholders across the state. In one basin, we went in, and there were letters to the governor coming almost every week. This builds on some of the Republican stuff after what Nicole was saying there. There was a terrible drought that came in. We had to regulate some folks. People didn't like it. Letters to the governor every week, letters to our agency saying that we weren't doing our job, we were treating people unfairly. We launched into a basin-wide planning process. Went through 5 years, shared data, shared information, built trust with those stakeholders. Following that planning process, no more letters to the governor, no more accusatory letters to our agency. But the communication continued. That person still would reach out to me. He would still send letters. He would still communicate. But the tone was, hey, do you know this is going on in the basin? Hey, I found this information. I think it will be really great, and you might be able to use it while you're implementing the plan. So that, to me, is success story number 1. Success story number 2, another basin across the state where we've had multiple iterations of integrated management planning. So we've engaged stakeholders in the process twice, 10 years apart, to come in and reevaluate where we are in the plan. I'm standing there talking to the full group of stakeholders about stream depletions and groundwater pumping and how they're related. One of the stakeholders who had been there the first time around raises his hand, and he says, wait a second, don't you mean consumptive use? We spent a long time, 10 years ago, talking about stream depletions and groundwater pumping and consumptive use, and it took a lot of work to come to the understanding that consumptive use is what matters, not the groundwater pumping. I smiled so big. I was so excited to be corrected in that way, to know that that stakeholder had remembered what we taught him the first time around and brought that back to the next meeting and said it in front of the whole group of stakeholders. That was by far the most rewarding moment that I've had in integrated water management planning in Nebraska. So to summarize, our legislative system is built on tools from the past. We've learned from what others have put out there. We put it into our statutes. But I do think that the most important part of all of that is the building the trust and maintaining that trust through the long term. And I believe that if you do that, you will also find your success stories in the water that you're managing in your areas. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all three of our speakers, and hopefully that gives you a little glimpse into what we do here in Nebraska, and you have some nuggets that you can bring back with you as you leave here. So it's all about learning from each other and applying what we can to other parts of the world. So we are ready for a short break. The next concurrent sessions will start at 11. We have 3 of those, and then we'll go into lunch at 12:30. So yeah, I will release you a reminder to complete the survey for each session you attend within the app. That helps us plan for next time. So thank you very much.